real pleasure to welcome Bernard Canavan here this evening. This is the first time we have shown him in an exhibition context. We've had occasional works of his before, and he is an absolutely intriguing man and an intriguing artist. And he has kind of painted a subject that hasn't really been recorded in artworks so much before. But somebody who is very much associated with this subject, and a dear and very old friend of ours. It's a real pleasure to welcome Gearóid to open this exhibition.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you, Bernard. I think we're competing with more than God and that you can, but nevertheless, the exhibition will be running for a number of weeks. And I'm certain that as the word of it gets about and as people come to see it, that the range of its ambition and the stunning effect of it will be reported on, and I have no doubt whatever about that. I'd say just a few words about context and then a few words that will reflect my own response, as it were, to the exhibition itself. Emigration and emigration as exile, as distinct from emigration as opportunity. Emigration as exile is a very well embedded motif in the story of Ireland, the historical experience of Ireland, for a very long time, indeed, from the time of recorded history. The earlier, if you like, mythological and, if you like, legendary aspects of it, until we come into historical documentation, are so familiar to us that we take them for granted. The notion of exile, of the saints, the islands of saints and scholars, the monks going out, leaving their country, the great wrench, the disruption, and all that goes with that. And in fact, the very fact that it's embedded in the language itself, in Irish language, Gearóid, as exile, rather than the more technical word imirce. Gearóid from Geor, meaning tearful, the tearful parting, the rupture. So that's a well-established, such a pervasive motif that we just simply take it for granted. And when we come to the more particular cohorts of emigrants that become part of our historical experience, the flight of the earls, the wild geese, and so on, we begin to start putting particular names and faces and experiences. But these are overwhelmingly elite groups who at one time or other in the historical experience of Ireland went into exile. And their story is ultimately the story as chronicled by poets and those who were the retinue of elites. It is really when we come to mass migration or mass clearance out of Ireland that the story becomes democratized, or that the experience, the witness to rupture and departure becomes a democratic, as it were, discourse, if that's not too pompous a way of saying it. But essentially what we find is that waves of Irish emigrants uprooted and clearly traumatized by the experience, and registering that experience at the moment of departure, in the act of departure, and as part of their record and deposit of settlement in their new host societies, is a feature of the last maybe 2.5 centuries. And it is well documented, obviously, in the key traumatic junctions of Irish history, the famine, to take the obvious example, the immediate famine and post-famine exodus. And the deposit of memories that leaves, overwhelmingly documented, it must be said, from the point of view of Irish America. And that brings me to what I suppose is, and was certainly for a long time, a neglected aspect of this. That is to say, the emigration waves that continued to pulse heavily, very heavily, to hemorrhage levels in the decades of the independent Irish state after 1922. And there is no decade which experienced that hemorrhage as severely as the 1950s, where we had a net loss within the decade of about 410,000. And moreover, contrary to the 19th century experience, where Ireland within the United Kingdom, emigration to an extent was almost a circulatory flow of labour within the islands. From 1930 onwards, overwhelmingly the direction of Irish emigration, and particularly the 1950s exodus, was overwhelmingly eastwards to England, and to Scotland to a lesser extent, but to Britain rather than across the Atlantic. Now, there was particular pain in that migration that took a long time to be articulated at any level. particular pain that is not to be compared with the famine in terms of absolute deprivation, emaciation, the hazards of the journey, but psychological pain that was deeply felt and deeply registered. Because remember, by the 1950s, that generation effectively were coming from an independent Irish state. An independent Irish state, one of whose primary myths was that the long period of Irish deprivation and underperformance and all the rest of it was due to political subjugation. And here we were 30 years after an independent Irish state, and not only was the exodus in a total huge outflow, but also it was from a state which had as its rhetoric that it was Ireland free and that the old enemy had been bested. And on top of that, there was the further myth that it was a virtuous people because of that, and virtue was the equivalent of no sex. Virtue equals no sex. And a sex-obsessed society presided over by an extraordinarily powerful clerisy meant that the dominant myths, the total cultural formation of those leaving in the 1950s proved to be, in a fundamental sense, disabling for their successful settlement in Britain. Not only because they were caught in this awful sense of resentment at being dislodged into the mouth, as it were, of the source of sin and the fallen people, but also finding that opportunity, a job, a chance to get on, and the NHS awaited them in the bosom of the oppressor. How were you to reconcile resentment and gratitude in the one breath? How were you to reconcile the formation, the historical consciousness of hurt with this kind of displacement? Many did. Many adjusted. Many, particularly women, did better than men. Overall, there are nuances one would have to have, but women did better than men overall, principally because their entry point to the labour force was not as severely, as it were, humiliating in many sense. They found it more easy, either in general service or in the privileged echelons of nursing, particularly. Whereas a large number of the men, irrespective of their background in Ireland, whether they were displaced labourers from a rural background or from small town rural Ireland, which would have been low-level service or retail, essentially entered the unskilled labour market at a point at which identities and names and places and familiar neighbourhoods and status all were exchanged for a generic padding. And how was that to be negotiated without a deep sense of alienation and hurt? Now, that world, for a very long time, by sober historical analysis, was relatively neglected compared to the fairly large volume of studies that were done on the Irish-American experience. When Bernard left in 1959, and he's a contemporary of mine, there were two books maybe in all on the Irish in Britain. John Archer Jackson's book, an early sociological, essentially short book, by an Englishman. Yes. And there was nothing much in terms of sober sociological or social history, as it were, available. What was there were certainly chroniclers of that great disruption, of the fracture and all of the kind of resentments and tormented, as it were, adjustment that took place, particularly among those who were casualties of it rather than survivors of it, or easy survivors of it. One found it in the writings of Donald McCullough, the Irish Navvy. One found it in some of the writings of John B. Keane. And one found it, of course, insofar as the women's experience of fleeing the repressively censorious Ireland in some of the early works of Edna O'Brien, for example. But as time went on, things improved. And certainly over the last 15 to 20 years, since the early 1990s, remarkably and wonderfully, that world, both in its joy and in its celebratory, if you like, presence in British society, and in its brokenness, has come into view and has found voices and representation in a whole variety of forms. It has found it, for example, through straightforward historical studies, wonderful work on case studies, the Irish McGordon's work in the Irish in Leeds, the Irish in Bradford, the Irish in Birmingham, and of course in Cowley's History of the Navy, in Enda Delaney's sober work on the Irish and the Irish migration to Britain from 1922 onwards, in narratives and life stories, for example, from returned emigrants, the coming home, the Mulvaney, if you like, retirement project, with all the life story histories that has been gathered there. And of course, the creative artists continued, not just John P. Keane, but Tom Murphy after him, and of course Jimmy Murphy as King of the Kilburn High Road. So there has been a great chronicling, and one finds it in popular music, running through not just Irish traditional music and its transmission intergenerationally through the poultice, but through the more hybrid and more aggressively ethnically coloured music, and witness, for example, the poets, to take that one example. So there has been a comprehensive, one might imagine, articulation. Now, that's a rather long-winded way of coming to tonight's exhibition, but there is a logic to it in this. I had experience of this world, the privilege of it, and the enlightenment of it, both as a student and afterwards living in Britain and getting to know some of the Irish community. Indeed, I met Bernard in the late 1970s, early 80s maybe. But one of the things that struck me about the Irish in London in particular was I came across, and Bernard will smile when he sees this because he is an actor in the story, a collection of photographs by Paddy Fahy, who was a social photographer in the London scene and who left a huge corpus of photographs after him. And Finbar Woolley, in the museum in North London, was introduced to Paddy Fahy by Bernard Canavan. He was the man who made the introduction. And not only was that large collection of the social life, now it was the brighter side of it. Paddy Fahy was a social photographer. It wasn't his interest, either artistically or commercially, to be photographing misery. So that what you got was the more celebratory aspects, the public rituals, the dances, the céilís, the social events, the first communions, the parades, the outings. How I immediately became attracted to the Paddy Fahy archive was that the first photograph that was identified as being typical of the 1950s was the Limerick men's outings to Southampton, 1957. And I looked at it, and there were 6 people in the photograph, and 4 of them were my neighbours. Rita and John Hagney, Nan Kenny, and Joe Hardiker's daughter. He used to mend our shoes. God, I said, what's going on? Now, that was the photographic record brightened. It was the record of those who found solace in the county associations, in the church, and in the association and culture of the ethnic Irish, the GAA, poultice, and so on. Bernard Canavan has chronicled those who were not easily or could not be ultimately encompassed, enveloped, supported in that world of solace, in those institutions. And what we have instead is essentially an extraordinarily powerful visual narrative of an aspect of Irish social history which went unchronicled in any form for a very long time. It is a disturbing one, frequently disturbing. Disturbing because of its implications, disturbing because of its imagery, disturbing because of its critiquing of the society, both which, if you like, decanted these people and later neglected them, and also because of the record of human travail, as it were, that it chronicles so powerfully. Now, I'm not going to go into great length on it, but I want to say some things particularly about where it has force. Bernard Canavan, the biography I'm not going to tar you with. He himself is of that generation, emigrated as a young teenager with his father in 1959. After a little time doing odd job works, effectively, his artistic inclinations and talents, which were already precociously identified by Marion King. Of those of you of a certain age will remember Marion King on the radio at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on RTE, painting and so on.
They all look too young.
No, they are disgustingly young, actually, now that I look around them. But essentially, the particular talents in terms of graphic artistry, illustrations of magazines, moving into theatre and other areas, with a brief interruption in Dublin, but overwhelmingly all of Bernard Canavan's life has been spent in London since then, observing, empathising with the generation that is around here, the generation which is in John McGahern, the generation effectively which literary people, including those who are in Liam Hart's anthology of 2009 on autobiographies and memoirs of the Irish in London. What we have now is, as I say, a powerful visual narrative of the social history of that particular cohort. And it is arresting, and it's strong, and it is very challenging, and it is uncompromising. And it includes pointed critiquing, and it is politically engaged with the historical junction at which it occurred, and politically engaged with the key institutions, even in their current position, as it were, in Ireland. One critic has written that his paintings are a long overdue visual monument to an invisible people, and I think that is a nicely phrased way of putting it. And it is strongly inflected, obviously, by his own personal experience and the experience of his father, which he has written about in a number of places. I'm just going to say a brief word. There are 30 pieces here. It follows a broadly chronological and thematic structure. It follows from the cultural formations of childhood and early adolescence, the myth of national liberation, and the geography with the irony of the suitcase, as it were, that the geography is essentially a geography to leave, and so on. The cultural formation is represented very strongly as oppressive, and for the emigrant, as I've already said, disabling in a deep sense. The items 25 to 29, for example, on the home place, are about desertification. Not just desertification of buildings and surroundings, but the desertification of a whole mental world, the desertification of a landscape of memory and attachment and affirmation because of the dislodging. The journey itself, the boats, and indeed that entire ritual, which was so common in all of our childhood, certainly of those of us who were in our late 60s. The Christmas train coming into Limerick Station with all of the stories of those, how bad the Princess Maud was, how overcrowded, everyone sick, who got on at Chester coming, who got on at Peterborough, who was delayed in Rugby. And we were more familiar with the railway timetables of the Midlands than Jim Houghton and those who were bred to it. I could tell you exactly what time the night train passed Rugby, because we would know if it were on time who would arrive in Limerick or who would arrive on the boat train the following morning. It was a common experience of Irish families all over. As I said, the journey. And of course the key shrines of that social world. Euston Station, arriving in Euston Station, heading for Euston Station on the way back, the smells of it, the early morning arrival, the absolutely calorie-horrific fries that were waiting at 6 a.m. before the dispersal.
The boat was always empty.
And then the chronicling of London life itself, the representation of the social reality, as it were, of work, of bedsits, of pubs, of places of work and of leisure. It is, as I say, a visual narrative of social history. In scale and in detail and in the richness of reference, some of these paintings are panoramic. And one can see there is an attempt to, if you like, to have a complex historical narrative of reference through symbols and icons and so on. And to effectively have the complexity of a historical narrative represented in panoramic form. Some of the key motifs, the ubiquity, for example, the ubiquity of religious iconography in the home front, lamps, pictures, the Sacred Heart, and so on. But equally, there is a ubiquity in the social scene in London. The ubiquity, for example, that is there where the men are, generally speaking, murky and muscular and melancholy. And in colouring, the women light up any picture that they're in. They light it up as an alternative. They light it up as the possibilities of pleasure, the possibilities of companionship, the possibilities of care, the possibilities of comfort in an otherwise bleak world that was without much of any of these. As I say, some of the paintings are panoramic in that sense. Some of the paintings are panoramic in that sense, and they seek to provide panoramic vistas, as it were, of the historical experience. But others are intimate. They're intimate but no less resonant, it seems to me, of the painful social process to which they attest. I would mention two, for example. The faces in number 16, which are fully realised as faces as distinct from Ó'Tuathaigh, and which are striking in terms of the melancholy, the deep burden of melancholy that is there in number 16, or indeed where there is no human at all. The sheer suggestiveness of the intimate object of the case with the boots, essentially. The emigrant case in the boots without any, which is on number 13 over here, just around the corner. And which doesn't have any face at all in it, and yet conjures up the human predicament, strikingly and heartbreakingly indeed, in light of the experience that was there. As I said, there's women and there are men, and the contrasts are pretty straightforward, but they're not straightforward, because of course the trajectory of women's integration into the host society was very different on a whole variety of ways, particularly after marriage and settlement, through the kids, through socialization in school, through networks in neighbourhood, through meeting other women, through the nurses, if it was the nurses as the case may be, or indeed through other networks which proved to be in a real affirmation. The Irish dancing classes, for example, where the women were the key, if you like, determinants of whether or not the children would be brought into that world, as it were. So there's a different trajectory, historical trajectory, to the story of the women, but their presence, the actual representation here, points up the contrast between the darker world of the men, with its melancholy, muscular world, and the macho thing of digging and having to prove oneself, the valorization of physical strength, and the need not to let the side down, and the kind of stuff that translates into the ballads, you know, McAlpine's Men and Camden Town of the Rough Lie Down, as a kind of defiance in it. Conditions were terrible, but we were the men for it, as it were. But the brokenness that was the price of that so often is what is principally represented here. Now, there are disturbing, insistently disturbing images here. The presence, as represented here, of the church, for example, of clerisy, particularly a censorious and a silent clerisy, has strong contemporary critiquing of recent discoveries in it. I was intrigued, I was bouncing off Bernard, he did not confess it one way or the other, that the cleric, for example, I was certain it was, yes, I'm certain that's Pius XII. He was reared in an Ireland where Pius XII's face was everywhere. You could not have a silent cleric that was not the face of the angelic shepherd. Am I right, though? Thank you very much. I'm delighted that yes, we won't force you to compare that. But there are others as well. Number 6, number 23 and 19, I would ask you to look on them for different reasons, because they are challenging critiques of institutional abuse of power, of contradictions, of essentially an oppressive narrative, the cost of which, in terms of a diminished sense of self, is everywhere among the groups that are in these pictures. And there is, I suppose, if I'm to be, Tom will say hopefully, brief at the end, there is throughout this what Swift would call a seva indignatio. There is an anger. There is an indignation about hurt and humiliation. There is a response, a witness to those who are badly used. The Irish translation of that famous song, Sean O'Deary Glana, finishes each verse with those who were worsted in the game. Sean O'Deary Glana, we were worsted in the game. In the game of modern Ireland, the rhetoric of achievement, the public ceremonials, a nation once again, church and state presiding over a happy society. Those who were decanted either into institutions within the island or in their thousands, in their tens of thousands to John Bull. They have a story also that needs telling. And the telling of that story in such vivid, forceful and powerful terms is not the least of Bernard Canavan's achievements. And as I say, I am absolutely certain that as this exhibition is viewed over the coming weeks, that the scope of its ambition, the integrity of its purpose, and the force of its impact will be acknowledged and celebrated. And it is a great pleasure for me to have been invited to launch it.
Well, to follow that. It is very moving for me for somebody to look at my paintings and tell me exactly what I was trying to put into them and trying to do when I was doing them. All I can offer really is footnotes on the very eloquent history that you've had of Irish immigration to Britain over the last 200 years. And perhaps to add one thing to it, my personal vision of it, or my personal experience of it. I grew up in a small town, of Edgeworthstown in County Longford. It was an 18th century estate town, and the big house at the end of the town was where the landlord had lived. He had lived there for many years. None of us read anything by Maria Ó'Tuathaigh when we were there. We regarded that as part of the landlord world. We knew nothing about the world of England except what we'd been taught. And when we arrived in England eventually, about 60,000 small shopkeepers in Ireland had to follow all the people who had left who had been their customers, and we were one of these. We had a very small shop. We had about a yard of counter, and people used to come in and tell me that a yard of counter was worth 20 acres of land. I'd rather have the 20 acres of land any day. Because it was the farmers more than, for instance, the small cottiers or the labourers who probably maintained the persistent vision of what Ireland was about. It was comfortable Ireland. It's what Donald Macaulay often referred to as comfortable Ireland. While all the rest of us, I suppose we were slightly marginal people in that we had a shop, and therefore we might be possibly middle class. But it really didn't look like that, it didn't feel like that to us. We were perpetually obsessed with the problem of how to pay the bills. As indeed, of course, everybody is always obsessed by that. But in a shrinking economy where large numbers of people are leaving, it is particularly poignant and difficult for us. When the Celtic Tiger came along, and I'd been living in London for many years, I came over to the Irish Government Record Office in, I think it's Molesford Street, and I went in there and I asked the lady, had she got anything on Irish emigration, reports about Irish emigration. I was teaching, I was interested in finding out a bit about my world, the emigrant world. And she said, emigration, she said, surely you mean immigration, I-double-M-I-G-R-A. I said, no, I said, emigration. Oh no, she said, we don't have any of that here. We don't have any of that. She said, but I'll go and look and see if I can find anything. And she looked on the computer and she said, no. She said, we have nothing at all on emigration. And I thought, out of all this great swell of money that Ireland, the Celtic Tiger was booming, I thought, surely they're not going to forget the very accurate figure that Gearóid had given of 400,000 in that one decade, but the 800,000 who had left between 1945 and 1970. What about all of these? What are we all doing? How are we to adjust to this world? And I decided to put together some pictures which I thought had a more immediate impact. And then, of course, the more I thought about the emigrant life, the more I was led back to thinking about the social conditions that led to emigration and the peculiar way that we had that we believed in ourselves. Because there's no doubt about it, the 1950s and 40s, if you were a successful Irish farmer or somebody in politics or perhaps a professional, a doctor or something like that, there was a kind of a comfortable world which people believed in. It was a hierarchical world. There was at the very top of it was the Pope, and the Pope we knew was in direct communication as Christ's vicar on earth. And whatever the Pope said, as I was always instructed by my teacher, if he made a prediction about the Longford County football association, he could be wrong. But whatever he said about faith and morals, he was always right. In other words, he had the power to open the gates of heaven. He could, whatever should be loosed on earth could be loosed also in heaven. And then coming down towards the local, to a more local level, the parish priest and his, in our case, his nephew, who was the local school teacher, and the local school teacher would teach us in school what it was that we were to believe in. And we believed very deeply and felt a great pride in the fact that we in Ireland were a unique country. We were totally exceptional. There had been no classical world for Ireland. It had never been conquered by Rome or Greece. It had no Reformation. It had no Renaissance. There was nothing to Renaissance about. No point in looking back. It had no Industrial Revolution.
Or French.
No, it had no Enlightenment. Absolutely, no Enlightenment. And so we were absolutely unique. And at the same time, because we were unique, we didn't have to learn anything about the wider world. We were, as it were, the people of the wider world should look to us for our leadership and our understanding. And yet here we were all on the boat. And the boat was a terrible experience. There's no doubt about it. There's no way I was 15 at the time, and being young and callow, none of these great issues mattered to me. But my father was 52 at the time, and he was in charge of this rather awkward 15-year-old entering life, and I thought I was supposed to be helping this elderly gentleman, who was my father. And there we were on the boat, and the boat was full of first-timers who had never left. They were in a state of anxiety and fear. We had never been to England, and we'd been told all our lives that England didn't like us. And the whole 800 years of tradition about suffering that they had inflicted upon it was a terrible story. And as well as that, the world that we'd been brought up in was radically genderized. Even in church you find women sat on one side, men sat on the other side. In dance halls, women sat on one side, men sat on the other side. In public meetings, women didn't come at all, they all stayed at home in the kitchen. And many people thought that was an appropriate place for them. While us men talked about politics, about the GA, about the great battles with the gun that was used. The gun was very important. I grew up in the years of the border campaign, 1956 to 62. Sean South from Gearóid, my name is O'Hanlon, all this. So, in other words, you could get a gun and you could go out and shoot somebody, and you would actually get a high mass set for you at the end of the day if you were successful, and otherwise there would be a lot of regret about what had happened, but nothing was actually done about it. Nobody went to prison. Now, I just want to, so it was a strange world that I arrived in. And when I came to England, I began to learn about a society that was much more diverse. There were Protestants and Catholics. Everybody had to muck together and try and make something work. It was a much, but of course the Irish, because we had no skills of any time, we were down on the hole in the ground. We Irish men. Irish women tended to go into a structured society of the National Health Service, where there were arrangements for education, arrangements for wages, a structure that you could move up in. And maybe as betokens that, Irish women tended to marry outside. They married outside the Irish diaspora. They married often English doctors or English people, while Irish men went down the hole in the ground, and it was a radical free trade world of which people fought for success. And you brought some of your friends over and you got them to work, and the subby was a universal figure of importance in that male world. The machoism of Ireland was transferred to the English building site. And the concern and comfort and ability of women to provide for Irish men was now in the wider situation in England, providing comfort and services and health for a wider population. So it was a very strange world. And I've come back, and this is one of the difficulties of being an Irish artist in England. I couldn't paint, for instance, Irish world that I had grown up in, changing radically. And I wanted to somehow put on paper some of that change. So what you see around you, as Gearóid, which I must thank. Thank you very much, Gearóid. And thank you, Tom, for, I forgot to give my thanks in the early part. Thank you, Tom, for arranging, and thank you, Dean Kelly, for helping out, and thank you, Anita, for promoting my work so well all over in many, many exhibitions, and thank you to Janet for also supporting me in some of these difficult things to think about when you're in England. I often thought, well, if I'm going to paint something that's actually critical of Ireland, how are Irish people going to take it? Am I going to be seen as some kind of West Brit or some kind of horrible anti-Irish Catholic? I believe really that people, whatever their beliefs, whether they're Hindus or Catholics or Protestants, they all have a right to their beliefs, but they haven't got the right to make everybody else dance to their tune. And they haven't got a right to control the institutions, either the educational system, the hospitals, the orphanages, the mother and baby homes, or the industrial schools. All of these are the Catholic Church getting control of. I think that instead of playing with guns, a lot of the Irishmen and Irish politicians would have been far better to think and learn about how to administer a proper civil society. And so my pictures have lots of reference to that around. So I'm going to stop because I've kept you quite a time. I'm going to stop and give you a chance to have a look around yourself.